A few weeks ago, we talked with author Dan Wells on our podcast, and he mentioned that it's pivotal for the Dungeon Master to find out their own skills, to discover what they themselves are good at. And then after that, we put out an episode, Tanner put out an episode where he talked about how to find what your strengths are, right? How to find what you are good at. And that got me thinking. What are the list of skills that a dungeon master needs to have and cultivate? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today on today's episode of How to Be a Better DM. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Justin Lewis, and this is the show designed to help you become a better dungeon master in storytelling without spending extra time, extra money, or extra hassle. I apologize in advance today for any background noise from my son. I'm on daddy duty for this episode, and it can't be helped. So without further ado, just want to say two things. One, thank you for listening, and two, let's get to today's show. This is, in its perfect form, a gut check for you as a dungeon master. It is essentially like a list of skills that you need to develop, and obviously we can talk about some ways that you can work on those skills, possibly at the end of today's show or in another podcast. But as I'm going, or maybe even after I do this, and you can sort of write these down or just kind of remember them if you're not able to write them down, or just come back and listen to the podcast, you can give yourself a rating on a scale of 1 to 10 for these skills. And there are sort of subskills involved as well, so if you want to kind of break those out, you can do that. But essentially, that should give you a roadmap for what sort of things to work on as a dungeon master. If you want to become a better dungeon master, this is essentially just telling you where you believe you're weakest and where you believe you're strongest, and that should help you know where to work on your skills. Now, I think something should be said here as well of two different strategies when working on skills, or I think three, maybe four. Number one is kind of doing it at random, just picking skills that you're like, oh, I have this opportunity, I can work on that. Awesome, right? You have someone gives you access to an improv class, so you're like, oh, I'm working on improv now. Method number two is you sort of just work on everything in a neutral way, right? You work on everything in a flat way, and it sort of improves all your skills at once, right? You're just kind of working on everything. I don't think either of those two methods are particularly, well, for one, they're not focused, but I don't know if they're effective in that you likely won't see as many actionable results. You're not going to see as much result from doing that because, well, it's not as focused, so any growth will be very, very small. Possibly. I mean, you could see it the other way. So the other two methods that I would recommend trying are either, one, focusing in on your weaknesses, or two, focusing in on your strengths. Now, both of these methods, I think, are valid depending on what you want to do. And also, one thing you also need to realize about these skills is that they are dependent on your play style. If you are more of a power gamer, and you don't really focus so much on the story, well, then you're probably not going to really need to worry about the story. I mean, you'll have to worry about it in some way, shape, or form, but I'm guessing you probably won't spend as much time role-playing or things like that, right? And if you do theater of the mind, you won't need to worry about doing online or in-person map making or minis or tokens or things like that. So it really depends on your play style as a dungeon master and what you like to do, as well as what your players are up for. So with that, let's dive in with skill category number 1. The very first skill that the dungeon master needs to at least be proficient in, and I suppose this also kind of depends on what you think is important, because this is sort of the skill list for Dungeons and Dragons, right? But the very first skill is the mechanics. And let me start out with a caveat. to get started and to play D&D as a dungeon master, you do not, repeat, you do not need to have a perfect grasp and understanding of the mechanics. What you do need to have is an understanding and a grasp of some mechanics that do facilitate gameplay. I've heard numerous stories of individuals getting started playing D&D in a dumbed down version. All they had was a D6, or they didn't even have dice. And yet they were still able to play, quote unquote, D&D, or at least a tabletop RPG. And to get started, all you need to do is have some sort of concept of mechanics and the ability to explain that to your players. And actually, those are some of the kind of breakouts of this skill category, right? So the sub-skill of this is you need to understand the basic gameplay of D&D. If you're going to play D&D, then you need to understand the general rules. As a rule of thumb, you need to understand the rules before you're able to break them. And really, you need to master the rules. So that's sub-skill A. You need to understand the basic gameplay rules of D&D. Subskill B is you need to be able to explain those rules to someone else of any level of understanding. If you're playing with kids, you need to be able to explain it to kids. If you're playing with adults, you need to be able to explain it to adults. You need to be able to communicate those rules, or at least the rules you're choosing to play by, in a way that allows the player to grasp them and not feel like they are foolish, because no one wants to feel foolish. The quickest way to maybe ruin your chances of playing D&D with people is make them feel foolish. Subskill B, then, is having mastered those basic rules, you then need to learn how to twist them or break them or create new ones, right? So in your D&D games, and also let me back up. These skills, like everything I'm laying out here, this is for the perfect quote-unquote dungeon master, right? If you found someone that was just good at everything, this is what they'd be able to do. Regardless of how they played, like they'd be able to do everything, even if they just decided to do only specific things. Anyways, so subskill C of mechanics is being able to create new mechanics for your game, whether that's in session prep or improv, right? If a player decides out of the blue that they want to start up a milkshake company franchise in your D&D world, first of all, you need to decide whether you allow that. And I personally think that that is a cool thing to allow. Plus, I really love milkshakes. But second of all, you need to decide how that is going to play out in the game. Are you going to actually have them make rolls to decide on a recipe? Are you going to have them sort of simplify the process and just make a roll for the entire franchise, and then the next franchise they do, it's just another roll? You need to decide the mechanics of how certain things will play out. And oftentimes that will be mid-game, oftentimes that will be in session prep, and you need to master both. So that's mechanics, right? Obviously, no one's going to know every single rule. I think the most important points of mechanics is, one, being able to decide on rules, and two, making that judgment call. Telling your players, this is how it's going to be, and sticking with it. Next up is story writing. Next to mechanics, as far as D&D is concerned, story writing is the second most, or maybe the second most imminent skill that you need to develop, right, in terms of urgency to play. In order to start playing or continue playing, you need to work on story and you need to work on mechanics. Once you get those two down, everything else is sort of just extra-ish. Within story writing, this is the concept of creating a story from start to finish, right? It's the whole shebang. But obviously, we can cut that into smaller things. Step one is being able to create interesting and compelling settings. This is sort of the cover art of your book, right? If you are writing a book. And that's not exactly a good analogy, but you get the idea. This is what's going to attract your players to the game in part and help them stay, for sure. Being able to describe and create this magical or non-magical world that they find interesting and compelling at every step of the journey. Okay, so you need to be able to create setting. Number 2, and probably maybe more important than setting, is character. You need to be able to create rich, dynamic, and useful characters. And when I say useful, I mean characters that aren't just there for no reason. Instead, they drive the plot forward and enhance the experience of the game. And this one, I think, is maybe one of the hardest parts of writing in general, and certainly being a dungeon master, because you need to have a really good understanding of people, which is funny because I'm guessing a lot of us out there are somewhat introverted. And if you're introverted like me, you probably consider yourself someone to have a very poor understanding of people in general. But we'll come back to that concept because understanding people it's pretty big. Next up in story writing is being able to write twists, turns, and developments. As a dungeon master, you need to be able to decide when things should go wrong for your players, for the world at large, and when things should go right, both in dramatically interesting and surprising ways. Now, not everything needs to be a surprise, of course. Sometimes you can telegraph, and sometimes you should somewhat telegraph or foreshadow what's going to happen. But for sure, you don't know everything that's going to happen. So you need to be able to allow what your players do, create those plot twists and turns, and then use it to your advantage. See, the good dungeon master says yes but the great dungeon master says yes and then uses whatever the player did to their own advantage to make the story better. Also, that's my son in the background. He sounds really cute, doesn't he? Next up in story writing is pacing, and this is important in terms of session prep. And when I say story writing, I really do mean in part session prep, because that's when you do most of your actual writing. You're going to write down stuff. And then when you start the session, all of that writing is going to kind of go out the window because your players are going to do something completely different. It's still important to be able to write, because on the off chance they don't throw out what you want, then you are prepared. But you need to be able to pace things. You need to know and have a good gut feeling of, okay, it's time to bring in some sort of change, or we can let this current thread keep going, and then we need to tie it off. Understanding pacing is a little bit difficult because, frankly, you need to do it with practice. You need to do it over time. And I wish I could tell you shortcuts around it, and hopefully I'll be able to come up with those in the future. But right now, the best shortcut you have for most of these skills is just practice. You obviously have good taste. I mean, you listen to How to Be a Better DM, after all. We thank you so much for your support. And if you've ever gotten anything useful from How to Be a Better DM, take a minute and rate us and review us on your podcast listening app of choice. It goes a very long way to helping our show help many more dungeon masters out there who are just like you. If you love our content, help others become better dungeon masters too. Hey, bud. How's it going? Just wanted to say, we like you. We think you're pretty cool. And we hope you like us too. If you do like us and what we're doing, you can support us on Patreon. Just $1 a month is enough. Just go to sessionzerostudios.com/Patreon and show your support. But even if you don't, we still like you, bud. See you around, bud. When setting any scene, it's imperative that you tap into the 5 senses. When it comes to sound, one of the best ways to do that is with music, ambiance, and sound effects. And that's why we've teamed up with Monument Studios. Monument Studios provides easy-to-use soundboards perfect for dungeon mastering in any setting. If you want to see this in action, go to fantasy-plus.com and get 10% off of your first month when you get their Fantasy Plus app by using the code BETTERDM at checkout. Again, that's fantasy-plus.com and BETTERDM at checkout. Use music to amplify your gameplay. Okay, so we talked about story writing, we talked about mechanics. Skill category number 3, player management. You know how I was talking about having a poor understanding of people? Well, this is where you work on that. Your players are a huge part of the game. They're a huge part of your game because guess what? At the end of the day, you are dungeon mastering for yourself, but also for them. And guess what? There's only one of you, and there's at least one other person. Other people sitting at your table, they have wants, wishes, and desires. And as the dungeon master, being the best dungeon master means you help them fulfill some of those wants, wishes, and desires in the context of the game, whatever that means for you and your table. So subskill A is scheduling management. To be the best dungeon master in the world, you need to be able to manage your own schedule as well as coordinate the schedules of all your players. Let's face it, when it comes down to scheduling D&D, the person that is most likely to do it is the dungeon master. Because frankly, if the dungeon master isn't there, the game doesn't happen, right? I'm not saying this responsibility should fall on the DM, but I am saying it most likely will because of just convenience. So being able to get people to agree and show up for something is a huge skill in most areas of life. And honestly, if you can master this skill, you'll probably see a lot more success in other areas of your life. Okay, the next aspect of player management is relationship management, because guess what? Even though this is just a game, and for a lot of us, it's pretty darn important, there are other things in our lives that are just as important and other things in our lives that are even more important by far, right? It is just a game. And it's a sad truth that with the other stuff that's going on in our lives, it's very likely that for at least some of you, probably all of you, at some point in time, something will go wrong between you and one of your players, or possibly one of your players and another one of your players. As the dungeon master, it is your job, one, not to get involved in things that aren't your business, but two, to make sure everyone at the table feels safe and relaxed and calm and able to play in the way that they want to, unless it kind of impedes someone else's ability to do the same thing. So that means that your role as the dungeon master forces you to be able to make peace or to build those relationships with your players. The best dungeon master has a really good relationship with their players, only because there's a lot of trust that's required on both parts, right? The dungeon master trusts that the player has good faith and good intentions in the dungeon master, and they're kind of going along for the ride. They're not going to purposefully derail everything the dungeon master says. And the player, vice versa, extends a lot of trust with the dungeon master. They've created this character that they really love and they really like to play as. And the dungeon master has a lot more power in kind of impacting the development of that character and making it into something that maybe the player doesn't want. And so if there's no trust outside of the game, you got to believe there's not going to be trust inside of the game. So with your player management, you need to remember what I said about understanding people. You need to try and understand your players. And, understanding people in general, like I said, it's a great skill to have in other areas of your life. So try and understand your players at a visceral level so that way you can help them have the best game possible. Because we're going to talk a little bit later, but you're essentially a event planner / performer. Okay, but more on that. So skill category number 4 is role playing. Now this one's obvious, right? And this is the one that we probably all lean towards, especially after watching shows like Dimension 20, Critical Role, High Rollers, Dungeons and Daddies, NADPOD. The list goes on and on and on and on. And even our show, Actual Play, our Actual Play show, Pact and Boon. But there are 2 aspects I'd say of these skills. 1, voice acting. Okay, this involves the actual tonality of your character and also, their accent, their demeanor in terms of how fast or how slow they speak. This is the words you say and use and how that impacts the social situations. Naturally, I've done a few podcast episodes on this, but also we're having one come out in the near future where we actually have a podcast, or not a podcast, but a voice coach come on the show. And hopefully you find that interesting, worthwhile, and useful. The next point is the personification of your different characters. And what I mean by that is the show, the not, and don't tell. So what does the role? What are your characters that aren't characters? Your NPCs. What do your NPCs do? How do they act when they aren't speaking? What actions do they take that show their character? Now, one note I do want to say is this list is not exhaustive. This is the best list I could come up with. But if you want to make additions or change it, reach out to us on Instagram or Discord or our email or whatever. Just let us know what things need to be changed, because we definitely love to update this. So number 5, the skill is improvisation. Okay. And I mean, I'm not going to actually add any sub-skills to this because frankly, they all kind of coincide to just improvisation, taking something that you didn't necessarily ideate and rolling with it and making it better. And we did an episode on this a while back with Taylor Salmon from Comedy Sports in Provo, Utah. You can check that out. I'll put the link in the show notes. It was episode 161. But hopefully we'll have more improv experts on the show in the future. Just know that you got to practice improvisation. You got to let go. Number 6 is presentation. A while back, there was a story of a speaker who was kind of talking to a number of other people that their main role was sort of proselyting a specific message, okay? And this speaker asked them who wants some cake, and he had some cake there, right? And someone raised their hand. They're like, yeah, I'd love some cake. He took a handful of the cake and he threw it at them. And then he asked, who else wants some cake? And no one else raised their hand. And after some coaxing, finally someone else raised their hand. And to that person, he cut the cake, put it on a piece of plate, put a fork in a napkin, and then handed it to that person. And he explained that for those 2 separate instances, the content, the substance was the same. But instead, the difference was the presentation. And in D&D, presentation can make all the difference, especially if you have such a great idea. And yet, because of your weak presentation, your great idea is not executed well. And I think this is one that a lot of dungeon masters overlook. So, for one subskill, you need to understand your presentation strengths and preferences. For 2, in order to be the best dungeon master possible, to me, that means you are perfectly comfortable and proficient in anything you do, and it means you have as many options as you want. You can do it in any format, depending on the wants, wishes, and desires of your players. So that means you need to master the use of online dungeon mastering technology. So that's VTTs if you use them. That's Discord or audiovisual technology such as Riverside or Zoom, Google Meet. That's also mastering the in-person elements of minis and maps. Again, you need to master these so that way you can say with a surety, yeah, I prefer theater of the mind because I just think that it's a more pure form of the medium. But frankly, if you're not a master of both, it's kind of hard to believe whether your opinion of them really matters because you're probably just picking whatever's easiest. So you need to master your presentation of D&D because, again, it is not just a game, but it's an event. It's an experience, and you are the experience giver to your players. Number 7 is lore. You need to have a full understanding of the lore of your world, as well as the existing lore around other D&D realms or worlds. And why is that? I mean, understanding your world that you create, obvious, right? If you're going to play in it, you need to understand it. But understanding the available D&D lore, you need to understand that because everyone else will be able to tack into that in sort of a common ground way. And they're going to do that regardless of whether you ask them to or not, right? People out there will have read R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt Do'Urden books, right? That's just a thing that's going to happen. And sometimes, maybe they won't. But if they have and you haven't, that makes it a little bit harder to establish some common ground. But if they have and you have, when they try and explain things using those familiar understandings, you will be familiar and you'll understand. Number 8 is experience planning. This kind of goes back to the presentation aspect, but presentation might deal a little bit more with public speaking, being able to communicate your thoughts effectively without using lots of filler words like and but and so, even though in this podcast episode you've probably heard quite a few of those. With experience planning, you're thinking of not just how things come out, but also what it feels like to be there. This is you cleaning up your space and actually making a full game room if you have the resources, or adding a little bit of extra wow factor. For example, I just talked with someone who told me about their first experience DMing, and they DM'd for their kid's birthday, and they made it a whole carnival theme session. And to kind of fit with that, they created real food like turkey legs and other stuff that you would find at a carnival that really enhanced the immersive experience. Stuff like this. Now, obviously, experience planning can be a little bit more expensive than other of these skills, but if you're smart and creative, you can find ways to do it for cheap. Last on my list is combat. You need to be able to make combat interesting and challenging so people aren't bored, but also you need to be able to make combat streamlined and smooth and, if possible, fast. Combat is possibly one of the most commonly appearing points in the game where people struggle, I think, because it's easy to kind of slow down, ironically, and get bogged down in the minutia. It's easy to have moments where people are looking things up or checking things out, and it's sometimes hard to make combat interesting when it's kind of going around and round and round and everyone's sort of doing the same thing. So learn how to speed combat up and make it interesting. And if you can't speed it up, make it interesting. Make it interesting is probably the most important skill of everything. And in all of D&D, if you can make it interesting, then it's going to work. And it's going to work for you. So those are my 9 skill categories of being the perfect dungeon master. And I hope you find something valuable in what I said today. And you probably have disagreed with more than one thing that I've said. That's totally fine. Like I said, reach out to me and we'll work on expanding this list together. But as I said at the beginning, the most important part of this episode is that as I'm going through what I talked about today, or maybe you go back and listen or you read it or something, you think about how you're doing with each of these. And give yourself some grace, but try and be honest. Try and see things as they really are. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. And then pick a skill or two and go to work. And I sincerely hope that with that plan, you'll be able to find yourself a year from now, a month from now, a day from now even, looking back and thinking, yep, I am a better dungeon master. I'm a better DM today than I was then. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Thanks for being patient with me and the background noises you've probably heard, as well as probably the lateness of our release of this episode. We couldn't do anything without you, so here's me sending all of my love, support, and good wishes to you as we sign off for another episode of How to Be a Better DM. We'll be back next time with another handcrafted episode just for you. And until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative. Brought to you by Session Zero Studios. For more information, visit sessionzerostudios.com.